My mother is dying, and I have no way home, she sobbed, standing alone in the cold rain outside a nearly empty train depot. Her hands shook around a dying phone. Her clothes were soaked through, and tears mixed with the water running down her face. She had called everyone she knew, but no one had picked up. Then a tired single father, walking toward his old truck, stopped beside her. He had just enough money left to get himself and his little son home. He had no idea who the woman in front of him really was, but when he heard her say, "Please, I just need to get to my mother before it's too late," something in him refused to let him walk away. He looked back at his son sitting in the truck, then at the crying stranger, and said quietly, "Come with us." Marcus had learned long ago that life didn't always give people what they deserved. At 34, he was raising his 6-year-old son Theo alone after losing his wife to an illness that had left their small family broken. Marcus worked as a maintenance technician at a regional freight yard, earning just enough to keep food on the table, pay the rent, and make sure Theo had clean clothes and school supplies. He drove a battered blue pickup that groaned every time he turned the wheel, but replacing it was out of the question, so he kept patching it up instead. That evening he'd picked Theo up from school after a long shift. His son had fallen asleep in the back seat, hugging a worn stuffed dinosaur. Marcus was thinking about the overdue heating bill when he noticed a woman standing alone near the train depot. At first he assumed she was just waiting for someone. Then he saw her phone slip from her hand as she collapsed onto a bench. Marcus pulled the truck over. He walked up cautiously and asked if she was all right. The woman looked up, her eyes red and swollen. She told him her name was Claire, and that her mother had suddenly fallen critically ill in a small town several hours away. She'd been trying to get there, but her bank card had been frozen after a suspicious charge, her phone was nearly dead, and the last train had already left. She'd called relatives, friends, even her office, nobody had answered. She'd been standing there for almost 2 hours, watching every way home disappear. Marcus looked down the road. It was already dark. The town she needed to reach was well outside the city, and his truck barely had enough fuel to get there. He'd been planning to use the last of his cash on groceries for Theo. If he drove Claire home, they might not have enough gas to make it back. For a moment he stood there, torn. He had a child depending on him. He couldn't afford to save everyone. Then Theo stirred awake in the back seat and asked why the lady was crying. Marcus looked at his son and remembered something his late wife used to say: "When you get the chance to help someone with nowhere else to turn, don't measure your kindness by what it costs you." He took a breath and opened the passenger door. He told Claire to get in. She stared at him like she couldn't quite believe it. He just said they'd figure out the rest later. Claire climbed in, still crying, thanking him again and again. Theo quietly handed her the small packet of tissues from his backpack. She took them and managed a tearful smile. For the first time that night, she didn't feel completely alone. They set off down the dark, rain-slicked roads. Marcus drove carefully while Claire kept trying to reach the hospital. Every unanswered call made her more anxious. Finally someone picked up, a nurse caring for her mother. Claire listened in silence, her face going pale. The nurse said her mother's condition had worsened and doctors were preparing the family for the possibility she might not make it through the night. Claire broke down. Marcus didn't ask questions. He just kept driving. Hours passed. Theo woke up and started chatting softly with Claire about school, his favorite picture book, how his dad always burned the pancakes on Sunday mornings. Claire laughed for the first time all night and told him her mother used to make pancakes too. That small exchange brought a little warmth into the cold truck cab. But Marcus's problems were mounting. The fuel light came on. At the next gas station he checked his wallet and realized he had barely enough to fill the tank halfway. He put in what he could and kept driving. Claire noticed and asked how much he'd spent. Marcus brushed off the question, he didn't want her feeling guilty. A few miles later, the truck began losing power. Marcus pulled onto the shoulder, popped the hood, and stared at the smoking engine. He knew right away the old truck had finally given out. Claire panicked. Her mother might have only hours left, and they were still far from the hospital. Marcus dug through the few tools in the truck bed and tried to fix what he could, rain pouring down his face, hands black with grease. Theo stood under an umbrella, watching his father work. Claire noticed something taped to the dashboard. A photo of Marcus's late wife holding baby Theo. She realized then that this man wasn't just helping her. He was carrying his own grief while making room for hers. Eventually Marcus got the engine to turn over. It wasn't running well, but it moved. They pressed on. They reached the hospital just before sunrise. Claire ran through the entrance without even closing her umbrella. Marcus and Theo followed behind her. A nurse rushed over and told her that her mother was still alive, though barely conscious. Claire went in and took her mother's hand. Her mother's eyes opened. For a few precious moments, they simply looked at each other. Claire cried as she told her mother she'd made it. Her mother weakly asked how she'd gotten there. Claire glanced toward the doorway, where Marcus stood holding Theo's hand, and said quietly that a stranger had brought her home. Marcus tried to slip away quietly, but before he reached the elevator, Claire caught up to him and thanked him again. He told her anyone would have done the same. She said that wasn't true. She'd called people with far more money and influence than he had, and none of them came. Then she told him something he never expected. She wasn't an ordinary office worker struggling to get home. She was the CEO of one of the largest logistics companies in the region. She'd kept her identity quiet while visiting a small branch office because she wanted to understand what life was like for ordinary employees without executives hovering nearby. Her company had been preparing to restructure several departments, and she'd spent months studying how those decisions would affect people at the bottom. She never imagined that the person who'd help her in her darkest hour would be a struggling single father who could barely afford the trip himself. Marcus told her plainly that he hadn't helped her because she was a CEO. He helped because she was a daughter who needed to see her mother. Something about those words stayed with her. Over the following weeks, Claire's mother slowly recovered. Marcus went back to his ordinary life expecting nothing in return. Then one morning his supervisor called him into the office and told him the freight yard had been acquired by a new group. Marcus braced for layoffs. Instead, he was offered a new technician role with better pay, health coverage, and flexible hours so he could spend more time with Theo. He refused to believe it had anything to do with Claire until he got a letter from her. She told him she hadn't arranged it as a reward. She'd simply recognized the kind of man he was and wanted him to have an opportunity he'd long deserved but never gotten. Months passed, and life slowly changed for Marcus and Theo. Theo no longer worried about whether they could afford school supplies. Marcus kept repairing his old truck rather than replacing it. He wanted Theo to remember where they'd started. Claire's mother recovered enough to go home, and Claire began visiting Marcus and Theo regularly. What began as a desperate night on a rain-soaked road slowly grew into a friendship built on trust and gratitude. One evening, Claire sat with Theo in the backyard while Marcus made dinner. Theo asked if she remembered the night they met. Claire smiled and said she could never forget it. She'd believed, at the time, that she was the one being rescued. But later she understood something deeper. Marcus hadn't just driven her home. He'd reminded her that kindness still existed. And sometimes the person who saves you in your darkest moment isn't someone with money or power. Sometimes it's simply someone who sees you hurting and chooses not to walk away. That rainy night, Marcus thought he was only helping a stranger reach her dying mother's bedside. He had no idea his kindness would open a new chapter in his own family's life, that the woman crying beside his broken-down truck would go on to help him rebuild a future he'd almost stopped believing in. He didn't know that sometimes, when life gives you the chance to help someone else find their way home, it may quietly be leading you toward a home of your own.